and Trump deceived Zelensky, or rather, Putin deceived Trump, but behind Zelensky's back, or perhaps Trump was happy to be misled by Putin's ideas after their meeting in Alaska. We will discuss all of this with you because the peace plan with its 28 points that has appeared on the horizon has, without exaggeration, caused quite a stir both in Ukraine and in Europe. Hello everyone, my name is Anastasiia Husarieva, and while you're liking this video and subscribing to our channel, I'll try, together with you, to reconstruct the chronology of everything that led us to this very 28-point plan, whether it's a peace plan or Ukraine's capitulation. Because opinions differ. You'll decide for yourselves and let us know in the comments. And I'll start reconstructing the chronology. So, on November 19th, 2025, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, arrived in Istanbul. Formally, his visit was presented as negotiations on prisoner exchange and the search for a just peace, as well as a demonstration of Ukraine's readiness for dialogue with international partners. The atmosphere of the meeting was marked by a high level of secrecy and a limited number of official contacts, which indicated the complexity of the political context and the difficult balance of interests among the various parties. The president was greeted, of course, by a delegation of representatives from Turkey, as well as the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, whom you literally just saw on your screens. So the meeting in Turkish, Istanbul, Turkey, carried symbolic significance. It demonstrated that Ukraine remains an active player on the international stage. However, from the very first hours, it became clear that the negotiation process was being shaped under conditions of opacity and restrictions that went beyond standard diplomatic practice. To understand the full intrigue of these closed-door negotiations, we need to start with the key figure, Steve Witkoff. He is not a diplomat, he is a special representative of the State Department and therefore of President Donald Trump. He is neither a military man nor even a politician. He is a businessman, a billionaire, a developer, known for his long-standing business connections and close personal relationship with the current president of the United States, Donald Fredovich Trump, whom you can see right now on your screens as well. It was precisely these relationships that made him an unusual but very effective channel of communication between the Kremlin and the White House. It should be added here that Witkoff was part of Trump's private circle of trust. His position allowed him to bypass bureaucratic procedures and formal diplomatic channels. And in fact, American presidents usually rely on these channels as well. So when Donald Trump wanted to get information quickly while bypassing official oversight, he turned to people like this. For him, Witkoff was not just an advisor. He became a personal diplomat who conveyed, signals and proposals capable of influencing political decisions. Witkoff actively used his contacts in Russia. He visited Moscow multiple times, meeting with high-ranking officials and people who had direct access to Putin. These were not accidental acquaintances. Through him, the Kremlin could transmit its terms directly to Donald Trump, bypassing the official channels of diplomats and the American president's advisors. In other words, Witkoff essentially became a secret communication channel that allowed the Kremlin to advance its own interests without oversight from Congress or the State Department. His role was critical in establishing a covert communication network between the two countries. He became a bridge between the American political establishment and the Kremlin's covert ambitions. Through Trump's personal trust, Witkoff turned it into a tool of geopolitical influence, allowing the Russian dictator to manipulate the process while bypassing any formal checks and analyses by government institutions. The psychological aspect of influence was very important. Witkoff understood how Trump's mind worked and skillfully exploited his passion for quick decisions, his desire to show results, and his trust in personal connections. He presented the information in such a way that Trump perceived it as personal advice from a trusted friend rather than official proposals from a foreign government. This allowed the Kremlin to shape a narrative in the American president's mind that was favorable to itself and to make decisions that bypassed traditional oversight mechanisms. In effect, Steven Witkoff created a private channel through which the Kremlin could directly advance its interests into the political sphere of the United States, leaving Ukraine without any control or participation in the process. It was thanks to him that the first transmission of political signals took place, which were crucial for shaping decisions at the highest level. And Witkoff's psychological skill made this influence almost invisible to the wider circle of advisors and analysts. If we return to this 28-point plan, which could make Crimea Russian forever, then let's break it down as well. Closed-door negotiations with Witkoff became an unofficial channel between Trump and Putin, the result of which was this very peace agreement plan developed by Trump's people and Putin's people. Ukraine is not involved in its development. The plan is being developed entirely outside of diplomatic structures. Although the plan formally contains 28 points, its content can be divided into four major themes, each of which defines key directions for political and security settlement. But before we move on to this plan, it's worth noting that so far, all we have are leaks in Western media. As for the official text of the plan, I think we will find out about it soon. But let's analyze what we already have. So, the first theme concerns ending the war and ceasing hostilities in Ukraine. Well, and this is actually the main theme. Russia can freeze the front and secure control over the occupied territories. Moreover, Reuters has published a map like this, where they mark all the territories that, according to this plan, Ukraine would essentially have to give to the Russian Federation. And while you're looking at this map, I'll tell you more details. The US is playing the role of peacemaker and gains formal influence over the process without direct military expenses. For Ukraine, this means that regaining control over parts of its territory will be practically impossible, and international oversight will remain symbolic and will not provide real protection. The second topic in this so-called peace plan is dedicated to security guarantees. Russia receives restrictions, namely on Ukraine's accession to NATO and on Kyiv's military capabilities. The US, in turn, retains the ability to formally support Ukraine but does not risk direct involvement in the conflict. For Ukraine, this means weak security guarantees, limited supplies of modern weaponry, a ban on joint exercises with partners, and restrictions on the ability to respond to escalations. But it is worth adding that the publication Axios, also citing its own sources, released information that allegedly, despite Ukraine not joining NATO and the non-expansion of NATO as demanded by Putin, Trump nevertheless agreed to provide Ukraine with security guarantees similar to NATO's Article 5. However, neither Trump himself nor official sources in the United States have confirmed this so far. The third topic concerns security regulation in Europe. Russia gains the opportunity to influence the security rules and strategic architecture of the region without Ukraine's participation. The United States controls the deployment of weapons and troops, maintaining strategic influence. Ukraine remains almost entirely outside the process. Its position is not taken into account, and its allies may reduce their support due to bilateral agreements with the United States of America. The fourth topic is one that regulates the future relations between the US, Ukraine, and Russia. Russia gains the ability to limit the supply of modern weapons to Ukraine, to influence Kyiv's economy and politics, but this time through Washington. The US sets the rules for support and cooperation, maintaining control, but without direct conflict with Russia. Ukraine remains in a passive role, dependent on the decisions of two major powers, without the right to make independent decisions regarding its defense or even its economy. That is, each of the blocs contains actual and practical mechanisms of influence. Military ones include freezing hostilities, controlling buffer zones, restrictions on training and armaments. There are also political ones, such as limitations on allied agreements and control over Ukraine's internal decisions, and economic ones, such as rules for cooperation or sanctions. And all this will give Russia the opportunity to put pressure on Kyiv's economy. International monitoring mechanisms that formally ensure neutrality but do not guarantee real protection. And in this way, the 28-point plan provides Russia with comprehensive political, territorial, and economic benefits, while at the same time leaving Ukraine limited in its sovereignty and without real security guarantees. Its implementation increases Kyiv's dependence on agreements between Moscow and Washington, creates the risk of splitting the international community, and forms a situation in which any violations of the terms by the Kremlin will be difficult to challenge. Let's take a look at how the world, and especially Europe, reacted to all of this. The global reaction to the possible 28-point peace plan being discussed between Trump's circle and Russia turned out to be much more explosive than its creators had apparently expected. After the first publications by NBC News and other media outlets, Europe was literally swept by a wave of outrage. In Brussels, the information was perceived as a repeat of the worst scenarios of the 20th century, when major powers decided the fate of smaller countries, but, crucially, without their participation. Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas emphasized that achieving peace without Ukraine's participation is essentially making a serious mistake. And this very position quickly began to resonate throughout Europe. France and Germany stressed that Europe will not allow the map of the continent to be redrawn without its involvement again. And Poland and the Baltic countries directly called the attempt to bypass the EU dangerous and unacceptable. In many European capitals, there was talk of the revival of spheres of influence, something Europe considered buried once and for all. In the United States, the reaction was quite different, not loud, but somewhat nervous. Part of Trump's team was indeed working on the document. This was reported by a number of outlets, including NBC News, Reuters, and Kyiv Post. And it's worth adding that this same information was confirmed by White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt. But the fact of negotiations through private channels came as a shock to many. A particular issue and many questions were raised specifically by the role of Steven Witkoff, whom we've already talked about, Trump's friend who became an intermediary between the United States of America and Washington. But at the same time, he has no official status except as Donald Trump's special representative. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was the first among officials in Washington to publicly give any kind of comment regarding the peace plan that was leaked to the press. Next, I quote, "Ending a complex and deadly war like the one raging in Ukraine requires a broad exchange of serious and realistic ideas. And achieving a lasting peace will require both sides to agree to difficult but necessary concessions. That is why we are developing and will continue to develop a list of potential ideas to end this war based on proposals from both sides of the conflict," wrote Marco Rubio on his social network X. And there is also a certain sense of irritation in Congress. Such decisions are not made in the shadows, and certainly not in the company of businessmen who do not bear responsibility for the consequences. In the US, there is noticeable tension now, mainly because any secret deals with Russia or negotiations during the election period could turn into a national-scale political scandal. Ukraine responded firmly and unequivocally. The idea that someone could decide the future of our country without our involvement after years of war and loss sounds like mockery. Kyiv has made it clear, any document that envisions the legitimization of occupation, restrictions on sovereignty, or any concessions to Russia is unacceptable. At the same time, Ukraine is avoiding an open conflict with the United States of America. It is extremely important not to destroy this alliance and support, as President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky emphasized in his address. And here, it is important to mention the position of Member of Parliament and co-chair of the European Solidarity faction, Irina Herashchenko. She represented the team of the previous president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, in 2014 to 2015. It was during that time that the Minsk agreements were signed. They were supposed to stop the war in Donbas. But despite the agreements, many issues remained unresolved. The border, control over the border remained under Russia's influence. Hostilities continued, and the so-called special status of Donbas created an opportunity for Moscow to influence the internal politics of our country. Zelensky, on the other hand, criticized the Minsk agreements as being extremely disadvantageous for Ukraine. And now Herashchenko is essentially repeating what was once reproached to her political force. The deputy also reminds the current government that nothing about Ukraine should be decided without Ukraine. And this is not just a nice slogan, but a principle of the state's survival. Back in August, after the Putin-Trump summit in Anchorage, Alaska, Herashchenko's reaction was one of the loudest within Ukraine. She warned that any negotiations about ending the war without Ukraine's participation would be a repetition of the worst lessons of the 20th century. Herashchenko reminded everyone of the principle of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine and said that it must remain inviolable because ignoring it in the past has already led to tragedies. For example, she draws historical parallels, and here we can also recall the Munich Agreement of 1938, when European leaders tried to appease Hitler and essentially gave him part of Czechoslovakia without the consent of its government. The consequences were catastrophic. This step paved the way for the start of World War II.
This cannot be signed in Munich. Well, because it's Munich. And there is no president here. And here we remember what things were signed once. Right? And I do not repeat such things.
And I do not repeat such things, said President Zelensky. But there is another historical example, the Yalta Conference of 1945, where negotiations between the great powers redrew Europe after the end of World War II and left the countries of Central and Eastern Europe under Soviet influence for decades. Now, after the discussion and publicity surrounding this so-called peace plan, Herashchenko criticized the monopolization of negotiations by the president's office, emphasizing that the billions invested in summits and international platforms have not produced the main thing, a clear and realistic plan to force Russia to peace. And the deputy also reminded that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine does not appear to play a role in these processes, while the key negotiations are being conducted by the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, and formerly by Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, who is now the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council. Russia's behavior in this context, of course, stands in stark contrast to everything else. In the Kremlin, there is a quiet, demonstrative restraint. They neither confirm nor deny anything, deliberately avoiding specifics. And that speaks louder than any statement. Silence is a sign of satisfaction. Russia sees in the plan a chance to solidify its occupation, weaken sanctions, and return to global politics as a major player, and to gain a direct channel for negotiations with the United States, bypassing Europe in the process. Such a scenario is perfectly convenient for the Kremlin. No responsibility, only benefit. As a result, the global reaction boils down to fear. Fear that the document could open the door for major powers to redistribute influence over the fate and future of smaller states. Fear that Ukraine is being turned into a bargaining chip and that Europe is being pushed aside from the process that determines its own security. A plan that was supposed to be peacekeeping has become a test of trust among allies, has heightened contradictions between the United States, provoked a sharp reaction in Ukraine, and given Russia a reason for satisfaction and yet another boost of confidence that they might succeed, perhaps even persuade Trump. And we continue to count on a real peace, on the hope that, after all, the final text of this plan will be on terms favorable to us. For now, we have an official statement from the President of Ukraine. He has instructed that there be very close cooperation with the United States of America. Moreover, the composition of the Ukrainian delegation for the upcoming negotiations has already been determined. The delegation includes the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, as well as the head of the Defense Ministry's intelligence, Kirilo Budanov. Also, the Foreign Intelligence Service will be represented, Mr. Kislitsia will be present at these negotiations. And you can also familiarize yourself with this list on the president's website. We very much hope that this negotiating team will be able to change the plans of those 28 points in our favor. And there isn't much time left, because according to international media, Trump has issued an ultimatum. The agreement must be signed by November 27, by Thanksgiving Day in the United States. We are waiting, watching, rooting for Ukraine and supporting the armed forces of Ukraine. That's the most important thing. See you in the next broadcasts. Take care of yourselves and wash your hands with soap. Bye-bye, everyone.